I want you to put yourself on the deck of a ship. It's late at night, October 28th, 1892.
Right.
You're out on the open expanse of Lake Michigan, and the temperature has just been, dropping steadily for hours. The air is thick with freezing spray.
Sounds miserable.
It really is. There's no moon, no stars. The darkness is just absolute. It creates this totally disorienting void where the sky and the water, they just become completely indistinguishable.
Which is terrifying on its own.
Exactly. And the wind isn't just a weather event anymore. It's a physical force. It's tearing across the open water with enough violence to make it difficult to even draw a breath.
Yeah, you can't even stand up in that.
Right. But, I mean, if you're a sailor in 1892, you've seen storms before. You know how to ride out a gale in a sturdy wooden schooner. The wood groans, it flexes, and kind of talks to you, giving you a rhythm to the chaos.
Right, wood has that natural give. But you aren't on a wooden schooner here. You are standing on a 300-foot hull made entirely of early industrial steel.
Which changes everything.
It changes the entire physical reality of the situation, because instead of that familiar organic flexing of wood, the sound coming from the darkness beneath your feet is something completely alien to maritime history at that point.
God, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's the sharp, sudden, concussive crack of heavy metal fracturing.
Oh, man. That specific sound and the terrifying reality of what it meant for the 18 men aboard the SS W.H. Gilcher, that is the focus of today's deep dive.
It really is one of the most haunting stories out there.
It is. We are piecing together one of the most baffling, unsolved mysteries in the history of the Great Lakes. To figure out what happened in the dark that night, we're digging through historical maritime logs, century-old accident reports, and like a really comprehensive Wikipedia encyclopedia entry detailing its history.
We have to look at the modern metallurgical science, too, to really get it.
Yeah, exactly. Our mission today is to reconstruct that timeline. But more importantly, we really need to understand the invisible microscopic flaw that was hiding in the very structure of this ship.
Because it's a story that perfectly encapsulates a very specific type of horror.
Right.
It isn't supernatural. There's no ghost or sea monster. The terror here comes from physics, chemistry, and just sheer human hubris.
Hubris is definitely the word for it.
Yeah. And as of today, in 2024, the W.H. Gilcher remains the largest undiscovered shipwreck in all of Lake Michigan. It's a massive steel leviathan that simply vanished, taking her entire crew with her.
Just completely gone.
Yeah.
So to understand how a cutting-edge vessel just disappears like that, we need to look at what this ship represented when she was built. The Gilcher was like the ultimate product of Gilded Age ambition.
Oh, absolutely. The late 19th century was this era of explosive industrial growth.
Right, and the men pouring money into these vessels weren't just sailors, they were industrialists. They were trying to build empires.
Yeah, you're looking at really prominent lumber and shipping magnates from Ohio, guys like William H. Gilcher, Randall E. Shuck, and Joseph C. Gilchrist.
Big names at the time.
Huge names. By 1890, they had already built a really formidable presence on the lakes, but the economic pressures at the time, they demanded more volume, more speed, more efficiency.
Always about the bottom line.
Always. They didn't just want another standard ship in their fleet. They wanted to fundamentally change the scale of what could be moved across fresh water. So they went to the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company and signed a contract for approximately $200,000.
$200,000.
Yeah.
In 1890. I mean, if I try to translate that into modern terms, factoring in inflation and just the sheer scale of the engineering, that is an astronomical investment.
It's a fortune. They weren't just buying a boat, they were commissioning a floating industrial complex.
Right, and the dimensions are just
staggering. Yeah. The physical dimensions alone were staggering for the era. The Gilcher was 301.5 feet long, 41.2 feet wide, and had a depth of over 21 feet.
Wow.
She was built with 6 massive main cargo holds. And the architecture above the main deck included this towering forecastle at the bow, a spar deck, and a bridge.
Okay, let me stop you right there because when we throw around maritime terms like forecastle and spar deck, it can be really hard for people to visualize.
Sure, yeah.
If I'm standing on the dock looking at this thing in 1890, what am I actually seeing?
If you were standing on the dock, you were looking at a sheer wall of steel just rising out of the water. The forecastle is the raised section at the very front, the bow of the ship.
Okay.
It's where the crew's quarters usually were, and it acts as a massive breakwater against head-on waves. And then the spar deck is essentially the upper continuous deck that runs the length of the ship.
Like a roof.
Yeah, like a structural roof over those 6 cavernous cargo holds. The entire design was centered around maximizing internal volume. She could hold about 140,000 cubic feet of cargo.
That sounds massive.
It is. In industry terms, that gave her a capacity of roughly 3,000 deadweight tons.
And just to clarify, deadweight tons refers to the actual weight the ship can carry safely, right? Like cargo, fuel, freshwater, crew, before it sinks below its safe waterline.
Exactly. It's a measure of carrying capacity, not the weight of the ship itself. But moving 3,000 tons of dead weight through the water requires an immense amount of power.
I bet.
So the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company outfitted her with a 1,200 horsepower, three-cylinder triple expansion steam engine.
Okay, I need an ELI 5 here.
Okay.
Explain it like I'm 5 because triple expansion steam engine sounds really impressive. But how does it actually work, and why was it such a game changer for a ship this massive?
It all comes down to thermal efficiency. In an older, simpler steam engine, you boil water, the high-pressure steam pushes a piston, and then that still hot, still pressurized steam is just vented out.
Oh, so you're just wasting all that extra energy.
Incredibly wasteful, yeah. A triple expansion engine reuses that exact same steam 3 different times.
Wait, really? How?
So the steam enters the first smallest cylinder at very high pressure, and it pushes the piston. As it expands and drops in pressure, it is routed into a second, larger cylinder pushing that piston.
Okay.
And then finally, it expands again into a third, even larger cylinder.
So it's literally wringing every last drop of kinetic energy out of the steam before letting it go.
Precisely. The Gilcher's engine had cylinders measuring 20 inches, 33 inches, and 54 inches in diameter, and all of them had a 40-inch stroke, meaning the piston traveled 40 inches up and down.
That is a massive piece of machinery.
It was a mechanical heartbeat. It turned a single screw propeller, pushing this incredibly heavy ship through the water at up to 9.5 knots, which is almost 11 miles per hour.
It's moving pretty fast for something that heavy.
Right. And feeding this beast were 2 single-ended Scotch marine boilers, basically giant coal-fired pressure cookers where the combustion gases pass through tubes surrounded by water to generate the steam.
It really paints a picture of this terrifyingly powerful heavy machine. But the real leap, the thing that makes the Gilcher so historically significant and ultimately so tragic, wasn't the engine or the size.
No, it wasn't.
It was what she was made of.
That is the crux of the entire story. Up until this point in history, the undisputed standard for shipbuilding was wood, and in some later cases, iron. But the W.H. Gilcher, along with her identical sister ship, the Western Reserve, they were part of a radical new vanguard. They were among the very first lake freighters constructed entirely out of steel plate.
Which is wild to think about. Because if I'm a sailor in 1892, I'm used to wood. As we mentioned earlier, wood talks to you. It has a natural, organic flexibility. A wooden hull bends over the waves.
Exactly. It has give.
When you shift to steel, does that change the psychology of the crew? Like, did it create a false sense of security?
It completely changed the maritime mindset. Steel represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering at the time. The logic pushed by the owners was very straightforward.
Which was what?
Steel is denser and stronger than wood or iron. Therefore, we can build the ship larger, and if it's larger, it can carry thousands of tons more cargo.
So they thought it was basically unsinkable.
To the industrialists, steel was invincible, and to the sailor stepping onto that rigid metal deck for the first time, it really must have felt like stepping onto a floating fortress. They believed science had engineered away the dangers of the Great Lakes.
But the thing is, when you build an expensive, state-of-the-art machine, you don't just let it sit in the harbor. The economic pressure to make back that $200,000 investment was just immediate.
Yeah. There was no break-in period.
They didn't ease the Gilcher into service at all. They pushed her, and they pushed the men operating her to the absolute breaking point right out of the gate.
The Gilcher's brief operational history is a fascinating study in corporate risk tolerance. She was commissioned on May 12, 1891, and the very next day, she departed Cleveland on her maiden voyage, hauling coal to Milwaukee.
Just straight to work.
Straight to work. And almost instantly, she began shattering records. In Buffalo, she loaded 3,150 tons of coal. That was the largest cargo of coal ever shipped out of Buffalo at that time.
And they just kept pushing the envelope, didn't they?
They did. By September 1892, she hauled over 3,255 tons of coal to Chicago. She was also moving colossal agricultural loads. 113,885 bushels of wheat on one trip, nearly 115,000 bushels of corn on another.
We have to pause and really consider what that means physically. Every single time they dropped 3,000 plus tons of dead weight into those 6 holds, They were running an uncontrolled experiment on the structural integrity of the ship,
That's a great way to put it.
because the steel hull is constantly fighting a war between gravity and buoyancy. The massive weight of the coal is pushing down, while the displacement of the water is pushing up.
And that leads directly to a series of red flags. Because this wasn't a flawless operation by any means. When we dig into the maritime logs, there is this creeping mechanical dread that starts to surface long before the final voyage.
Yeah, let's talk about the mishaps.
In April 1892, the Gilcher runs aground at Point Edward on the Canadian side of the river. The cause: her wheel chains parted.
Just to clarify, for anyone unfamiliar with late 19th century steering, the ship's wheel on the bridge wasn't electronically connected to the rudder, like today, right? It was a purely mechanical system.
Well, purely mechanical.
Yeah.
Turning the wheel pulled heavy iron chains that ran the entire length of the ship to physically pivot the massive rudder at the stern.
So if those chains part, you lose all steering. You are completely at the mercy of your own momentum.
Which is terrifying when you consider her mass. A 300-foot ship losing steering is bad enough, but when she is fully loaded, carrying over 6 million pounds of coal, she becomes a massive unguided projectile.
God, that's scary.
The fact that the heavy chains simply snapped under the tension suggests that the mechanical components were severely struggling to handle the sheer physical forces required to control a ship of that precedented size.
And it wasn't a one-off incident either. Just a month later, in May 1892, she runs into heavy ice in Duluth, Minnesota. The ice physically crushes and breaks her wheel. She is completely disabled and has to be towed all the way back to Buffalo for repairs.
Yeah, that had to be humiliating and scary.
I want to really linger on the psychological horror of that specific moment for the crew. Imagine being in the middle of Lake Superior. The ice is thick enough to literally shatter your steering mechanism.
And I can't do anything about it.
You are entirely helpless, trapped in a freezing steel box, relying on a tow line connecting you to another ship, just to drag you hundreds of miles back to port.
The isolation and vulnerability would have been profound. These men were essentially test pilots for the steel era of shipping, but operating under the relentless pressure of Gilded Age commerce.
Yeah, the owners sitting in their nice warm offices in Ohio only saw the record-breaking profit.
Exactly. But the crew were the ones who actually felt the deck vibrate. They were the ones who heard the horrible grinding of the ice against the hull. They knew, intimately, that this supposedly invincible ship had a history of vital components just catastrophically failing.
Which sets the stage for October 1892. You have a massive, heavily burdened ship made of a totally new material with a documented history of mechanical failures, and they are about to sail straight into an atmospheric buzzsaw.
The timeline of the final voyage begins on October 26, 1892. The Gilcher departs Buffalo, heading for Milwaukee, and in her holds is a staggering load: 3,080 tons of coal. Yeah. Captain Leeds H. Weeks is in command, overseeing a crew of 17 men. 18 souls in total.
And the start of the trip was fine.
Yeah, for the first 2 days, the passage across Lake Erie and up through Lake Huron is uneventful. The historical records confirm they passed through the Straits of Mackinac, the narrow waterway connecting Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on October 28th.
They pass the straits, they look out over the expanse of Lake Michigan, and this is where the weather turns.
Yeah.
And it's so important to establish that they weren't sailing into a standard rainstorm. The system sweeping over the northern Great Lakes that afternoon was an absolute monster.
It was a freak of nature. The meteorology of the Great Lakes in late autumn is notoriously violent anyway. You have massive fronts of freezing Arctic air pulling down from Canada.
Right.
And when that dense, freezing air collides with the relatively warmer, humid air sitting over the vast bodies of fresh water, it creates rapid cyclogenesis. The atmospheric pressure just plummets. It generates hurricane-force winds that can stretch for hundreds of miles.
And on the Great Lakes, the wind creates a very specific kind of danger, doesn't it? It has to do with the fetch.
Yes. Fetch is the unobstructed distance that wind travels over open water. Think of it like a runaway train. The longer the track, the more momentum it builds.
Okay, that makes sense.
As the wind screams across the hundreds of miles of Lake Michigan, it continuously transfers energy into the water. It builds waves that grow larger and more violent the further they travel. But unlike ocean swells, which are generally wide and rolling, Great Lakes waves are incredibly steep.
And dangerously close together, right?
Exactly. The frequency of the waves doesn't give a ship time to recover from one impact before the next one hits.
So put yourself in the boots of Captain Weeks. It's mid-afternoon, but the sky turns the color of bruised iron and then just goes pitch black. The temperature drops below freezing. The wind goes from a stiff breeze to a deafening roar.
It's pure chaos.
And you are sitting on top of 3,080 tons of coal. Let's talk about the danger of that specific cargo in heavy seas, because coal isn't a solid block, it shifts.
Right. Shifting cargo is actually one of the primary killers of bulk carriers. If a ship rolls deeply to one side, the millions of pounds of loose coal in the hold can act like an avalanche. It just slides to the lowest point.
And once it slides,
When that mass shifts, it radically alters the ship's center of gravity. The vessel loses its ability to right itself. It stays pinned on its side, taking on water until it ultimately capsizes.
man, and once they pass through the straits and enter that storm, the isolation is absolute. We really have to remember this is 1892. There is no radio. There's no radar. You can't call the Coast Guard for a helicopter rescue.
No, you're on your own.
Once the darkness swallows you, you are entirely cut off from the rest of humanity.
The sensory deprivation combined with the physical violence of the environment is just hard to overstate. Visibility drops to zero. The sound of the wind screaming through the rigging and the concussive booms of 20 or 30-foot waves slamming into the steel hull, it would be deafening.
They are trapped in a violent, freezing, lightless world.
Which brings us to the most chilling part of the entire historical record. Because the only reason we have any clue about what the Gilcher experienced in that darkness is because another terrified crew happened to cross her path.
Wait, really? Someone saw them?
Yeah. In the days following the storm, as battered ships slowly limped into harbors, investigators began piecing together eyewitness accounts. The critical sighting occurred roughly 5.5 hours after the Gilcher passed the straits.
Yeah.
At approximately 8:00 p.m. on October 28th, Captain Buchanan of the wooden schooner Seaman was fighting for his own life in the gale, roughly 20 miles northwest of North Manitou Island.
Through the freezing spray and the pitch black, Captain Buchanan looks out and sees a massive silhouette. It's a large steamer. But the details he provides to investigators are what elevate this from a tragic sinking to a maritime horror story.
Buchanan observed that the towering steamer was violently rolling in the waves, but it appeared to be completely unresponsive to the helm. It was dead in the water.
That's the worst possible situation.
And even more disturbing, he noted that the ship was entirely dark. There were no lights visible, and there were absolutely no signs of life anywhere on the decks.
Let's dissect the horror of what Captain Buchanan is actually seeing. A brand new $200,000 300-foot steel ship is rolling aimlessly in the trough as a violent storm. To be unresponsive means she has lost propulsion, her engine is dead, or she has lost steering, snapping her chains just like she did back in April.
Either way, it's fatal.
And to have no lights and no life on deck, what does that mean? Were the 18 men trapped below deck desperately trying to fix the boiler? Were they already dead? Was this massive ghost ship just being tossed by the lake waiting to die?
From a nautical perspective, what Buchanan witnessed was a death sentence in progress. In a severe gale, survival depends entirely on the ability to maintain headway, meaning forward momentum.
You have to keep moving.
You have to. The captain uses the engine to push the ship forward just enough to keep the bow pointed directly into the oncoming waves. The bow is designed to cut through the water. If you lose power or steering, you lose your ability to face the waves. The wind and the water will immediately pivot the ship broadside, making it parallel to the waves.
You get caught in the trough.
Exactly. The trough is the deep valley between two wave crests. When a ship is trapped broadside in the trough, the full, unimpeded force of the wave slams directly into the wide, flat side of the hull. It violently throws the ship from side to side.
So they're just getting battered.
When Buchanan saw the Gilcher unresponsive and rolling, he knew the ocean was violently shaking those 3,080 tons of coal. It was only a matter of time before the cargo shifted or the hull simply gave out.
He watched this dark, silent machine heave in the violent water, completely helpless, until the storm simply swallowed it back into the darkness.
Just horrifying.
So the massive, unavoidable question is, why? How does a state-of-the-art vessel suffer such a catastrophic, total failure just hours into a storm?
Wait, didn't they test these steel hulls? Weren't there safety inspections before they let a crew take a 3,000-ton load onto the lakes?
They did test the steel, but they were testing it based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the material's chemistry under extreme dynamic stress.
Wow.
To truly understand the autopsy of the Gilcher's sinking, investigators had to look at a parallel tragedy.
New sister ship.
Yes, the Gilcher had an identical sister ship, the Western Reserve. And the Western Reserve suffered a shockingly similar rapid catastrophic loss under nearly identical circumstances.
Wow.
When two brand-new cutting-edge sister ships die inexplicably, you stop blaming the weather and you start looking at the microscopic structure of the ship itself.
And what they found was an invisible chemical monster woven into the very steel the ship was built from. The culprit was early Bessemer process steel. Right. The Bessemer process is one of the most important industrial innovations in human history. It was the first method discovered for mass-producing steel from molten pig iron inexpensively.
Because before that, steel was really expensive.
Oh, absolutely. Before Bessemer, steel was a luxury material. It was way too costly to build entire ships out of it. Bessemer changed the math, allowing the Gilchrist Syndicate to afford a 300-foot steel hull.
But the key word there is inexpensively. And usually in industrial manufacturing, inexpensive means fast.
Exactly. I like to compare early Bessemer steel production to trying to bake a loaf of bread in a 500-degree oven because you only have 10 minutes. Yes, it's fast, but the outside is going to be burnt and the inside is going to be raw.
That's a great analogy.
You lose all control over the delicate chemistry. The Bessemer process involved blasting air through molten iron to oxidize and burn away impurities. It took only about 20 minutes to convert a massive batch.
20 minutes. That's nothing.
It's incredibly fast. But because the conversion was so violent and rapid, metallurgists had almost no time to analyze or carefully adjust the composition of the alloys.
And the specific chemical failures of that fast process were fatal. Let's get an Eli 5 on the metallurgy here.
Yeah.
What exactly went wrong inside that molten metal?
Two critical chemical contaminations occurred. First, the early process could not efficiently burn off phosphorus, which was naturally present in the iron ore.
Okay.
Second, because they were blasting regular atmospheric air through the molten metal instead of pure oxygen, they were violently forcing massive amounts of nitrogen into the liquid steel.
So you have a final product heavily contaminated with phosphorus and nitrogen. What does that do to the physical properties of the steel hull?
It catastrophically destroys the metal's ductility.
Ductility.
Ductility is a solid material's ability to undergo significant plastic deformation before rupturing. The easiest way to visualize this is the paperclip analogy. You can take a metal paperclip and bend it back and forth multiple times before it finally snaps. That ability to flex without breaking is ductility.
At a molecular level, why does pure iron bend? But this contaminated steel snaps.
Pure iron has a very specific crystalline lattice structure. Under stress, those layers of atoms can actually slide past one another, absorbing the energy. But when you introduce phosphorus and nitrogen into that lattice, it's like throwing sand into a gearbox.
It just seizes up.
Exactly. The foreign atoms wedge themselves between the iron atoms, locking the entire crystalline structure in place. The layers can no longer slide. So instead of bending under stress, the energy has nowhere to go and the structure simply shatters.
The steel becomes fatally brittle. And that brings us back to the environment of Lake Michigan. Because a ship in a storm is constantly experiencing extreme physical stress. It isn't just floating flat like a toy in a bathtub.
No, it is undergoing immense, constant torsion loads. Imagine the 300-foot Gilcher in a severe gale. The waves are 30 feet high. At one moment, the bow of the ship is cresting one massive wave and the stern of the ship is cresting another.
Leaving the middle unsupported.
Right. The entire middle of the ship, the part holding 6 million pounds of coal, is suspended over the empty valley of the trough. Gravity is pulling the middle of the ship down with immense force while the ends are pushed up. In naval architecture, this is called sagging.
And then seconds later, the exact opposite happens.
Yes. The wave passes under the middle of the ship, pushing the massive weight of the coal upward, while the bow and the stern are left hanging over empty air. Gravity pulls the ends down. This is called hogging.
So the ship is just constantly bending back and forth.
The hull is constantly being bent upward and downward over and over again, and then you add torsion when the ship is struck by waves at an angle, physically twisting the long steel hull like you are wringing out a wet towel.
Now combine that sheer violent physics with brittle, nitrogen-contaminated steel. The ship was literally incapable of absorbing the energy of the lake. It couldn't bend.
It was essentially a glass ship.
I want to return to the psychological terror of the crew in those final hours. You are trapped in the dark. The ship is dead in the water, caught in the trough, rolling violently. And instead of hearing the familiar, organic groaning of a wooden hull flexing to absorb the impact, you hear the deafening, concussive sound of the steel shattering.
Just terrifying.
It must have sounded like cannon fire in the dark. Did Captain Weeks know? Did the crew realize that their state-of-the-art fortress was literally cracking apart at the seams beneath their feet?
Based on Captain Buchanan's timeline of seeing the ship completely unresponsive, it is almost certain that catastrophic structural failure was already well underway. The brittle steel hull was likely fracturing from the sagging and hogging forces.
And that lets the water in.
Right. Those fractures would have immediately let in freezing lake water. If the water reached the boiler room, it would have killed the fires, destroying their steam pressure and instantly rendering the engine dead.
A cascading failure.
Exactly. The steel cracked, the water rushed in, the engine died, the ship lost steering. It turned broadside into the trough, and the violent rolling ultimately sealed its fate.
It is a dark, incredibly violent end. And when the sun finally came up on October 29th, the screaming winds died down. The lake began to settle, but the Gilcher was gone. The only thing left behind was a trail of debris and a haunting silence.
The storm had been indiscriminate in its destruction across the lakes, but the evidence of the Gilcher's fate was impossible to ignore.
Yeah, other ships found the wreckage.
In the days following the sinking, Captain Dennis of the schooner John Shaw was navigating the waters off South Manitou Island. He reported sailing through a massive, devastating debris field. He saw a medium-sized sailing vessel completely bottom up on the beach, later identified as the schooner Ostrich.
Just a graveyard.
And amidst the wreckage floating in the lake, he saw furniture and large sections of a ship's bridge.
But the definitive proof came from the steamer White and Friant, right? They found the pieces that put a name to the tragedy.
Yes. The White and Friant recovered shattered pieces of a pilot house floating in the same general area off the Manitou Islands. The debris was unmistakably from the W.H. Gilcher.
Let's analyze that debris field forensically. If you find the pilot house and the bridge, which are the absolute highest structures on the vessel floating independently in the water, what does that tell you about the mechanism of the sinking?
It points to an incredibly violent, catastrophic end. The upper superstructures of a steel ship don't just gently float away. For the pilot house to be ripped off, one of two things had to happen.
Which are?
Either the brittle steel of the hull fractured so completely that the ship literally broke in half on the surface, freeing the upper decks to float away.
Oh, man.
Or the ship foundered and sank so incredibly fast, plunging bow first or stern first into the depths, that the trapped air inside the superstructure and the violent friction of the rushing water physically tore the wooden pilot house right off the steel deck as the massive weight of the coal dragged the hull to the bottom.
For weeks, as more wreckage washed up on the shores of Michigan, the families of the 18 men held out desperate hope. But the lake eventually offered up a final, heartbreaking piece of evidence. On November 18th, nearly 3 weeks after the ship vanished, a discovery was made on the freezing shores of Fox Island.
Searchers walking the beach found the ship's massive mizzenmast washed ashore, and near it they found the bodies of 2 crewmen.
And the detail here is just grim.
The men were wearing life preservers, clearly stenciled with the name W.H. Gilcher. The tug Onward eventually recovered those bodies, returning them to Traverse City on January 3, 1893.
We have to stop and think about the implications of those life preservers, because it changes the narrative from an instantaneous, oblivious death to one of prolonged, agonizing awareness.
Exactly. The presence of the life preservers is the most harrowing piece of the entire forensic puzzle. It proves that the sinking wasn't a sudden, unexpected capsizing where the crew was trapped in their beds.
They knew it was happening.
Captain Weeks and his men knew the ship was dying. As the hull was screaming and fracturing in the pitch black as the freezing water was flooding the engine room, the men had enough time to realize they were doomed, find their cork life preservers, and strap them on.
It forces us to confront the reality of those 2 specific men who washed up on Fox Island. The life preservers worked. They kept them buoyant.
Which means...
That means those 2 men likely survived the initial violent plunging of the Gilcher. They were thrown into the freezing, chaotic waters of Lake Michigan in the middle of a hurricane-force gale. They floated in the pitch black, surrounded by the churning wreckage of their shattered $200,000 fortress.
A living nightmare.
They fought for their lives in the freezing water, completely alone, only to slowly succumb to hypothermia and exposure before the currents finally washed them onto the sand.
The psychological terror of those final moments is almost unfathomable. 18 men, trusting their lives to a state-of-the-art marvel of Gilded Age engineering, sent to the bottom of the lake by a microscopic lack of ductility. It was a tragedy engineered by hubris and executed by the indifferent violence of nature.
And what makes this story linger, what makes it so deeply unsettling even today, is that the lake swallowed the Gilcher whole, and it refuses to give her back.
Following the relatively recent discovery of the car ferry SS Marquette number 18, the W.H. Gilcher now holds a very dark, very specific title.
Right, it is the absolute largest shipwreck on Lake Michigan, whose location remains a complete mystery.
It is a staggering fact. In an era where we have incredibly advanced deepwater sonar, autonomous submersibles, and high-resolution bathymetric mapping of the lake floor, a 300-foot-long, 40-foot-wide steel giant filled with 3,000 tons of coal is simply gone.
It underscores the vast scale and the terrifying depth of the Great Lakes. We like to think that our technology grants us mastery over our environment. The Gilchrist syndicates certainly thought their cutting-edge Bessemer steel made them invincible, but nature doesn't care about our contracts, or our investments, or our arrogance.
No, it really doesn't.
Nature will simply apply pressure until it finds the microscopic flaw.
And that is the broader historical takeaway from the Gilcher. The failure wasn't just mechanical, it was systemic. The maritime industry, driven by intense economic pressure, rushed an unperfected, poorly understood technology into mass commercial use.
They didn't do the math.
They prioritized the speed and cheapness of the early Bessemer process over a rigorous, patient understanding of the material's fatal limitations under stress. They built an invincible ship out of glass and sent 18 men into a storm to find out how easily it shattered.
Which leaves me with a thought I really want you to take away from this deep dive. The men of the Gilcher died because their society rushed a bleeding-edge technology into the world before fully understanding its breaking points. The invisible flaws were baked right into the foundation of their modern marvel.
It's a pattern we see over and over.
As you go about your day-to-day, look around at the cutting-edge systems we implicitly trust our lives to. Whether it's the opaque algorithms that manage our financial markets, the artificial intelligence being integrated into our power grids, or the automated software driving the vehicles on our highways.
Yeah, what are the microscopic, poorly understood flaws hiding in those structures?
Exactly. What invisible cracks are woven into the systems we rely on, just waiting for the exact right storm to apply the pressure that shatters them?
It is a profoundly unsettling question. Every generation believes they have finally built the unsinkable ship.
They always do.
Yeah.
Until next time, we're leaving you with that eerie image to carry with you. A 300-foot steel ghost ship, heavily laden with coal, resting silently somewhere in the pitch-black, freezing depths of Lake Michigan, entirely undetected, holding its breath for over 130 years. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive.